to SISE, a week-long virtual conference on sustainable infrastructure and the Gigaton Challenge. My name is Eric Vettel, and I'm the president of the American Energy Society, and I'm pleased to welcome you back to the second day. In case you missed the first day, or in case you need a refresher, there were many highlights on Monday, the first day of the conference. We had three speakers. The first was Secretary Stephen Chu, who gave us a quick history lesson about the changing climate, and then pointed out the unprecedented warming that is taking place right now. In his opening keynote, former DOE Deputy Secretary Dan Poneman offered, among many other topics, new ideas and new opportunities for nuclear power. And then in her address, Melanie Kenderdine of Energy Futures Initiative reminded us that choices about energy always have economic trade-offs. For instance, all energy, from oil to solar, will deplete and destroy ecosystems, environments, and regions if brought to scale. Basically, the speakers on the first day addressed the massive carbon problem and the need for solutions at similar scale. In other words, gigaton problems need gigaton solutions. Our next speaker has practical experience in search of gigaton solutions. To understand the changes he seeks, I'd like to provide a bit of background. A case can be made that the electricity grid is at the center of the gigaton challenge. Indeed, the grid might be modern history's greatest engineering triumph, the world's largest machine, and utilities are the operators. Most people don't know this or even understand it or care to understand it, even though their computers, their transportation, their communication, their medicine, their food, this conference, everything happens because utilities provide the electricity that powers it all. Even though utilities are the foundation for modern life, there is also enormous pressure for utilities to change, to reimagine the grid so that it better accounts for safety, fairness, abundance, and justice. Oh, and by the way, offline, before you all joined, we were speaking with our talking with our speaker, who shared with us another level of change that has to take place with respect to the coronavirus and safety and security, and having to deal with that, address that when sheltering in place. It's just too much to even comprehend right now. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. To be honest, many utilities tend to resist this effort to make changes at gigaton scale levels because they're too big to change or because their business culture resists it. Exelon embraces these changes, embraces gigaton scale change. Exelon is one of the largest electric companies in the world. It provides power to more than 10 million people in Illinois, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C. In fact, many of you are probably watching this conference right now using the electricity that's provided by Exelon. It has the capacity to generate about 35,000 megawatts of electricity, though, Chris, I'm sure you might update that. And Exelon is at the forefront of the utility sector, leading, adapting, shifting, reinventing itself as a solutions-oriented first mover. And by the way, all you fellows, I just learned this morning when I woke up, the first email that I read, that Exelon is also sponsoring the SISE Fellowship Achievement Awards to recognize fellows who have pursued or shown interest in the mapping project and how it might relate to the gigaton scale solutions. So fellows, we'll be circling back on that, but we're grateful for the generosity and the kindness of Exelon and in support of that mapping project and all you fellows, and we'll explain more about that later. All this is to say that our next speaker, Chris Gould, is ideal for this conference. Chris is the Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategy and the Chief Innovation Officer, which means he is the architecting a vision of the energy future. And if that isn't enough, Chris is also the Chief Sustainability Officer, driving Exelon's climate change initiatives and commitments to reducing greenhouse gases. Chris will be taking questions at the end, which is a good thing, Chris, because I've already got quite a few myself, but I'll take those offline. We want to make sure the fellows get their shot. Chris, we'll turn it over to you. Thank you very much for being here.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Eric, for such a warm welcome and introduction about Exelon and myself. Appreciate the opportunity to be here, everybody. Fantastic conference and effort, mapping and everything that's happening. So really appreciate it and very proud to be here with you today and to be a sponsor. So with that, I'm going to, as Eric said, walk you through a bit of a personal experience that is the backstop to the matters that Eric raised around the gigaton challenges, and just sort of what it means for me, and then talk about it more broadly about what needs to be done and how some of these solutions may come into play. So I will share my screen now, and hopefully you will all see what I see. And with that, I will begin. So what you see here, as I said, starting with a personal account here of what climate change means to me, are my three children. My wife and I are very proud parents of Zachary, Maya, and Addie. And like most parents, we dream of them enjoying a world that is at least as wonderful and as the one we have experienced. And we hope that they all have the opportunities to prosper and even more. We know they face certain challenges like we have, but their future is at risk in a way unlike anything we have experienced. And that risk is climate change. Like you all probably want to leave your families, communities, and the planet with a brighter future than the one that we were given. And unless we address the issue of climate change head on, our children's future will be very different than the one our parents gave us. Recently, the UNIPCC issued another sobering report about climate change. And although this report and similar reports are full of data and scientific facts that are very informative and meaningful to this discussion, it can be a bit difficult for the average person to really appreciate the impact of the changes that are occurring. And so I want to share with you some pictures that might help with that. I'm going to help you try to imagine these changes by sharing a trip that I took last spring. I had the incredible experience of visiting Antarctica. There's nothing quite like seeing and experiencing a place so different that it gives the term climate meaning and the idea of change real substance. In the middle is my 83-year-old father. It was on his bucket list to visit all 7 continents, and my brother and I were game to be his traveling companions on this adventure. And even though I hadn't consciously made it a bucket list goal, I've had the opportunity to visit 6 continents, and this would certainly be my chance to do 7. Most people's first question is, how did you get there? And this is where it gets interesting. This is Drake's Passage, the 600-mile waterway between South America and the Antarctic Peninsula. I learned that the cruising community calls it the washing machine, because on ships, the water washing up on the portal windows looks like a laundromat washing machine with the water. I started to picture what happens to clothes in the washing machine, and I wondered if this would soon be my fate. And how do you know it's really Drake's Passage? You see that bird. It's called a wandering albatross, and they only live down there. Spotting them on the way to Antarctica is appropriately called a rite of passage to Antarctica, because they have the largest wingspan of any bird on the planet at 12 feet, and it is the only bird that can fly continuously for 10,000 miles without landing. Besides being interesting about the bird and the laundromat, keep this picture in your head. We're going to come back to it when we talk about leadership being one of the key components of fighting climate change. And we'll talk about one of Antarctica's famous explorers, Sir Ernest Shackleton. The second question that I get is, what does it look like down there? And the best way to describe what it felt like to be in Antarctica is unearthly. It's the closest thing that I will experience to leaving the planet. Try to guess which. These are 2 pictures, 2 different pictures from 2 different places. Try to guess which one is the moon, one is a lunar landscape, and which one's Antarctica. Of course, the color on the right gives it away, but otherwise they are eerily similar lunar landscapes. But did it always look this way? This is an artist's rendering of what the continent must have looked like in the Mesozoic period, when it was connected to the other land masses. It was covered with green trees. If you told its earliest inhabitants, dinosaurs, that one day their land would be completely covered in ice, they would have thought you were crazy. Looking at it now makes you believe and understand how dramatically things can change over time. And it's a perfect way to imagine the dramatic changes for the future as depicted by the IPCC report. Nobody knows exactly what happened way back then, but we do know from research that the period was marked by rising temperatures and CO2 levels. It is widely believed that the rising sea levels and ocean acidification as a result of global warming played the leading role in this transformation. So back to Antarctica. The Antarctic Peninsula is an area that scientists call a red zone, where there is evidence of significant global warming, with measurable increased snow melt and loss of ice sheet mass. In the morning after we crossed Drake's Passage, our captain announced that we had arrived in Antarctica, and that if we looked in the water, we could get our first glimpse of the massive icebergs that pepper the sea against the backdrop of Antarctica. I jumped up, it's a 2.5-day trip, so as much as I could jumped up, looked out and saw these icebergs bobbing up and down in the water. And I have to say, I was not impressed. As he kept talking about the massive size of this iceberg, I slowly began to realize something unimaginable to me. It turns out I was looking at the wrong thing. What I thought was Antarctica in the backdrop was actually the iceberg. This is the A157A iceberg that broke off the Antarctic ice shelf. It's the size of Aruba. I thought the small little bobbing icebergs that I was looking at were the icebergs and the backdrop was Antarctica. Wrong. This iceberg can fit 3 Manhattans on it, and I don't mean the drink. This is where today's warning signs are particularly relevant. The UN report that I referenced specifically mentions Antarctica. Quote, in the Antarctic ice sheet, the rate of mass loss has tripled relative to the previous decade. I think we've seen this movie before. Recall what caused the massive change in the Mesozoic period. Remember what triggered it, climate change from the ocean acidification and rising sea levels from global warming. I hope this helps you all see what climate change looks like from my view from the window and the similarities to how it has happened before. This was our first stop, Deception Island, named that way because it looks like an island, but because it's an old volcano, it is more like an atoll with a lagoon in the middle, not visible from the sea. What we're looking at are whale oil ruins from more than 100 years ago. Whale oil was an energy innovation in its time. It replaced candles. Unlike other sources of energy, it was odorless and smokeless, and you could use it to light lamps. Early adopters in Europe and in America gobbled it up. And of course, hunted almost to the brink of extinction, thousands of whales were killed and their remains processed into these boilers that you're looking at in Antarctica that stand today on Deception Island. So what saved the whales? Another energy innovation. Kerosene was discovered to be cheaper, more available source of light, and whales hunting slowed and eventually stopped. And this all formed the foundation of John Rockefeller's Standard Oil. And so that was the story of whales and how energy innovation saved them. This is the story of why we need to innovate now. Unless we take action, the evidence shows that we can expect continued rise in temperature, the red line. What the Paris Agreement is trying to do is stop and limit that rise to 2 degrees Celsius, the blue line, to avoid the most catastrophic outcomes of climate change. What the background shows is the growing implications of not doing so. Drought and flooding, wildfires, polar vortexes. It's increasingly about the extremes. And this is where, if that is why we need to innovate, this is where we need to innovate. We know what we have to do to limit our temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius. We need to essentially eliminate greenhouse gas emissions from all major segments of the US economy, including from sources associated with transportation, industry, agriculture, and commercial and residential buildings, energy usage. That's right, just about all of it. Global greenhouse gas emissions need to be at or around net zero by 2050 in order to halt climate change and achieve the goals outlined in the Paris Agreement. This means we must move from 53 gigatons of CO2 equivalent annual emissions today to about zero by balancing the amount of emissions that are released into the atmosphere with those taken out, the gigaton challenge. And how do we do that? Just like with the whales, we need to start with energy innovation. We start by cleaning the electric sector, preserving carbon-free nuclear and adding renewables and storage and greening natural gas to power the other 4 sectors. We need to turn this picture on its side. And so what could that look like? This picture shows how the transition needs to occur from the old to the new. In addition to preserving existing nuclear plants, which provide over half of all the carbon-free energy in the US, several key technologies will be at the forefront of decarbonization. Renewables, electric vehicles, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, and biofuels, and probably many others that none of us can envision today. There is not a certain path, but we know a path needs to be developed and followed. These can help to reduce energy-related carbon emissions, which account for 62% of global emissions. A recent Morgan Stanley report, Decarbonization, the Race to Net Zero, estimated that $50 trillion will be needed globally in these technologies over the next 30 years. At Exelon, we're investing in these technologies for our customers. For renewables, we are investing capital to modernize the grid for many purposes, importantly, including to enable renewable integration for our customers in leading wind generation states, such as Illinois, Pennsylvania, where we have distribution and utilities. In addition to grid investment, Exelon is also an investor in Volta, a first-of-kind battery storage venture fund spun out of Argonne Labs to integrate wind and solar into the grid and commercialize storage where it's needed to integrate the renewables. In terms of hydrogen, Exelon was recently the recipient of a DOE grant to co-produce clean hydrogen at a nuclear facility. For carbon capture and storage, we are an investor in Net Power, a first-of-kind CCS technology. And for electric vehicles, Exelon is an investor in Proterra, a leading electric commuter bus technology, and we have made a public commitment to electrify 30% of our utility fleet by 2025 and 50% by 2030, taking a leadership role in our communities. And of course, we are a leading advocate for the preservation of existing nuclear plants, which provide over half of the carbon-free energy in the US today. So when we talk about leadership and what is needed, we talk and think about how do we innovate? If that was the why and the where, how? And the answer has to be with fearless leadership. And so we must ask ourselves, are these examples enough to achieve our 2C goals? The answer is no, not even close what we need for deep decarbonization. These are examples of technologies that have a path to commercialization, but so many technologies do not, and we need them all to achieve our 2C goals. And so I look back to my Antarctica trip for lessons and inspiration. This is the British explorer Ernest Shackleton, who led an expedition to Antarctica in the early 1900s. While on expedition, his ship, the Endurance, appropriately named, was caught on ice and crushed to pieces in the middle of the Weddell Sea, just off the Antarctic Peninsula. You can see his ship in the background and what he must have been imagining seeing that sight. He and his 28 members of his crew were stranded in Antarctica with only lifeboats and small amounts of provisions. This is a picture from that moment. Look at him. Look at his face. He is looking out at an endless sea of ice, looking for a path forward to achieve his goal of returning 28 men safely to their homes. just like we are looking for a path forward to limit the impact of climate change. So let me unpack this journey just a bit more to give some context. Shackleton's ship was crushed in the Weddell Sea that you can see on this to the right of the Antarctic Peninsula. He spent 15 months living on ice, eating seals, and moving his camps from location to location to avoid falling into the sea should the ice break beneath them before making a miraculous landing on Elephant Island in 2 small lifeboats. Only 9 days later, after 15 months of living on the ice through the Antarctic winter, he and 5 of his crew set sail in their tiny lifeboat to South Georgia Island, some 720 miles away. Remember Drake's Passage. Remember I said we'll come back to that picture. That's what he had to cross in a lifeboat. Imagine going across that waterway. With no navigation equipment, after 2 weeks, they miraculously landed on South Georgia Island. They land on the wrong side of the island, where they are looking for a fishing village, and they spend 2 weeks hiking across never traversed snow-capped mountains and forests before finding the village. They said that when they emerged from the forest to the village, the children thought they were Yeti monsters in ragged clothes. After being in the frozen Antarctic for 16 months, Shackleton and his men leave 3 days later to rescue their men on Elephant Island. 4 months later, and after 4 failed attempts, he reached Elephant Island. And against all the odds, he rescued all 28 men. His ship was crushed by ice, and named the Endurance is certainly poetic at the very least. And so if we answered the challenge to climate change crisis in the same way that Shackleton answered the challenge to his men and mission, what would that look like? What would we do? How would we respond? How would you respond? Last week, Ceres issued an annual benchmarking report of the top 100 utilities in the nation on emissions. The report shows that Exelon is the cleanest by a factor of 2 times more zero carbon megawatt hours than the next highest, largest investor-owned competitor utility. But is that enough? Would Shackleton think that's enough? Does it measure up to his 20 months and 4 failed attempts at rescue? Think about the importance of failure and innovation. No, it's not. So we're doing more where we can be impactful. Last year, Exelon and the Exelon Foundation launched a first of its kind new $20 million climate change investment initiative, 2C2I, to cultivate startups working on new technologies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate climate change in our communities. The focus of this initiative is to help the early stage startups challenging paths forward, often overlooked startups that need to find the next generation technologies to move forward and find a path in our communities that we serve in Chicago, Baltimore, DC, Philly, Wilmington, and Atlantic City. We're the first US utility to launch an impact investment with our foundation of this sort. We have some very exciting news coming out tomorrow about our first cohort of startups in the 2C2I program and our invitation for the second cohort. So please stay tuned and watch for the news from Exelon and the foundation. And a bit of advertising for the program. Do you have a startup or business concept for the next energy source to drive society forward? Do you have an innovative business approach for improving efficiency, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or accelerating transportation electrification? Have you developed any inventions that could help our communities better adapt to the coming challenges of increasing heat, storms, and flood risk? Applications are open if you do. And so it comes back to the whales. I didn't know that Antarctica would hold so many lessons for me, and I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to share them with you today. Leadership saved Shackleton and his crew. energy innovation save the whales. Now leadership and energy innovation must and will save them. So I thank you for your time today. That ends my presentation, and I will welcome Eric. If there are questions, I will welcome them from the audience.
Hey, Chris, this is fantastic. I don't know if it's possible to have chills throughout the entire presentation, but I did. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes, you do have questions. They're pouring in. I'm sorting and sifting through. I'm going to be calling on Louis, Giselle, Gavin, Suzanne to start, but Jay submitted a question that was in text. I'm going to paraphrase because he didn't have the benefit or to benefit from our offline conversation. He was asking about what does Exelon do about nuclear waste, et cetera. But I'm going to layer on a question on top of Jay's because I thought it was a good one.
I was using my notes on this exam,
sorry, Chris. And what I'm going to do is ask, what about just immediate emergency? What about immediate response, such as the coronavirus? I thought the fellows might like, and the audience, and the audience too, might like to hear what was Exelon doing the day that we found out about, or the shelter in place? How did you respond to nuclear repair, et cetera, during Corona, and also nuclear waste?
Yeah, so as I was remarking before with this group, I am lucky, we are all lucky and blessed to be, have an amazing group of individuals and leaders at Exelon and in the nuclear industry at large who have been safely operating these plants for decades. And as you can imagine, nothing changed. In fact, these are exactly the type of people that you want during a crisis. The industry is infamous for preparing and drills and prepare, and prepare more. So seeing what was coming, I would say is the first example is we obviously didn't wait until we knew about those orders. Our organization was preparing long in advance at the slightest hint of what was coming. And we had a wealth of preparedness and procedures that we could call upon for just such events, although nobody could anticipate the scale. So these were things about how to conduct refueling outages in safe manners and safe ways that would protect communities and also keep the lights on in the clean energy for our customers and communities. And so I think it's a matter of, an industry and a company that is well positioned and well prepared for such events.
Crisis was already built into how do you respond, right? I mean, it was already part of the DNA, so it has to be.
It's part of the DNA. It's part of the industry. It's part of what makes the nuclear industry what it is. And so the challenges that arise are never going to be what they look like on paper, but right. The training, the preparedness are all part of the DNA and can be activated immediately for such purposes.
Great. Giselle, let's go to Giselle, and then we're going to do Gavin too, and then Louise. Giselle, do you want to lead off?
Yeah, sure. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Oh, hi, Chris. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'll make it quick. In regards to Exelon's support for nuclear energy, one of the things I personally think is going to be extremely important in encouraging more nuclear energy use in the future is the persuasion to have more people be comfortable with nuclear power plants, like how they view traditional fossil fuel power plants. So one of the things I was wondering is, what is Exelon doing in terms of the necessary marketing or communication strategy to address the misunderstanding and the fear surrounding nuclear power plants that will eventually need to change at some point in the future? And regarding the nuclear waste comment from Jay, how do you think we need to move forward to address the ways in which many places just simply seek to avoid having nuclear waste stored away in their natural reserves?
Right. Great questions. Thank you so much. So, in terms of the future with nuclear, there are many next generation nuclear is being developed by national labs and private investors at this particular point, and Exelon's playing a role in staying close to that technology on many levels. But in terms of existing nuclear, we have advocacy positions about the need for nuclear to be part of the solution, given what I've talked about, it being providing over 50% of the carbon-free energy in the United States. So we have many different communication channels around nuclear advocacy, whether they be advocacy in Washington or our state and local levels, and direct communication with customers and communities in our neighborhoods and such. And our employees are also very passionate. We have something called Nuclear Matters, and we have very much embraced the idea of having this whole discussion about nuclear and its role its important role in the future. So it's a great question, and we have many channels that we try to get that message across. And in terms of nuclear waste, it immediately goes discussions about Yucca Mountain and the federal government and what needs to happen in order to store waste on a larger level. And we welcome that discussion as well. We're proponents of a solution for that. Until then, we all know that the waste is safely stored today. And so this is like any other matter. We need to continue to advocate for a solution that accommodates all needs and concerns.
Giselle, thanks for that was a pragmatic, practical question. Love it. Gavin, do you want to get yours out there? Gavin?
I guess it's not working.
Oh. Do you want to type, Gavin, do you want to type your question, and I can, if we can't hear you?
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Chris, so much for coming on today. It's like hearing your talk. So, around this topic.
All right, well, Gavin, while you work that out, Suzanne, how about Suzanne, and then we'll go to Louis, and then Gavin again. Keep trying, Gavin, or text me. Suzanne, you want to go?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Chris. Thank you very much for your talk. It was very well built. It was almost a lesson in public speaking. Thank you very much. I was wondering, when you mentioned the program that you have to invest in new technologies, the 2C, 2I program, and you mentioned the investment in reducing greenhouse gases emissions. I was interested to know if you're also investing in carbon capture technologies. And then Nathaniel shared a paper with us that mentions the plan to build a carbon capture pilot project in Texas. Could you talk more about that project to us, and if there are other initiatives, maybe at the university level and research level, initiatives that are being funded by Exelon as well?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. So yes, that just like some context for the answer first. I made reference to it and thank you for your compliment, by the way. I made reference in several points about how the path to decarbonization is going to need to evolve, right? That they're going to have to be, with the challenge laid out of decarbonizing essentially the economy. Obviously, we're going to have to look at a lot of different technologies to do that, particularly when you start looking post 2030 towards this 2050 goal, where you start to kind of some of the existing limitations. There are a lot of technologies that are under development. I mentioned new nuclear. I meant, carbon capture and storage, as you have asked about, and all the way through. Those are big, sort of centralized, power production type facilities, all the way through, distributed energy sources such as solar or things like that, through customer-oriented solutions that help customers reduce demand and such. So the context and point being that we, like any company, like any researcher or institution in this space, need to have a broad net that we look at, where we think opportunity may exist. So in this particular instance, on carbon capture and storage, that's correct. We have a pilot program, pilot facility in Texas called Net Power. That's a next generation carbon capture storage technology that we think is promising. It was something that we developed in a consortium that really came off the drawing boards in basic research and development, and we have helped to bring it to commercialization and are hoping to be able to have that pilot completed here in the very near future. If it's successful, it will be able to capture carbon in a way that can be productive for other downstream needs, like enhanced oil recovery or other types of materials and things of that nature, where we can capture carbon and repurpose and use it. And potentially that can be part of a solution as well, not just nationally, but globally in other countries that are trying different paths forward as well. So yes, that is something that we are invested in. And likewise, we have the program that I mentioned is one of many ways. The 2C2I program is really focused on solutions that are specific to our communities and our cities, and it's an impact investment in terms of putting criteria forth to invest in the very earliest startups that are often overlooked. And as I said in my talk, it's going to take much more. It's going to take leadership. And so we're trying to lean in and find the very earliest technologies and innovations where our help can be impactful to that startup at a very early stage in many ways, with a particular focus on our communities. And so the story's to be told. I said we're going to have an announcement about that first cohort tomorrow. I hope you'll look at, and then we'll be inviting others for the next cohort. So thank you for your question.
By the way, there's more questions. Chris, we're coming out with a list of all incubators and accelerators in the United States, top 500. We got to find out the 2C2I cohort. We got to make sure those 6 are in there. So Katie will probably be circling back with someone, because this has got to be celebrated. That's fantastic. I'm gonna speak for Gavin, because Gavin had a great question. And Gavin, I can't believe you had a problem with your audio. Who's ever heard of such a thing on video chat, right? Geez. Gavin's question, actually, I'm gonna paraphrase Gavin. Gavin had enormous respect and appreciation for your presentation, what you do. And it sounds to me, he's saying, Chris, how do we make sure you have authority, ability to move Exelon? He trusts you. Do you have the ability to shift this, to change this, the course of this ship? Because Exelon's big. He trusts you.
Okay, good. Well, if you trust me, trust that I trust Exelon. So would be my first answer to that. First of all, thank you for your trust. This is, part of the reason why I prepare such a talk is to share it and make sure that people understand, where I'm coming from on a personal level. So, and I can assure you that that is the message that I take into Exelon in my work. So there is a, complete alignment in terms of what I'm talking about and what I'm trying to accomplish with what the company's trying to accomplish. And you can see that, for instance, the initiative that I just spoke of didn't exist over a year ago. It didn't exist. And so I was able to, with my colleagues, think of this, new thing, right? Impact investing and, kind of looking at these risky early stage startups and, bringing that forward to our leadership team and asking and recommending and asking for the opportunity to go forward with such an initiative. There are lots of reasons why a Fortune 100 company may not do that, that you may suspect, underlying your question, but they did, but we did. And so I would, rather than just, sort of talk about it, I would, I would point to and invite others to look at the evidence that is change, and it is exactly what our company is about. And the launch of this initiative and where we're going with it is just one of many things. We talked about advocacy for clean energy and what it means for our customers and communities in the nation and the planet at large. So this is I'm very proud to work for the company because I think our interests are completely aligned, and progress is being made in that regard.
Thank you. Karen, I think I'm pronouncing your name right. I'm so sorry, Karen. Karen had an early question. I want to make sure we circle back. Karen?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for your talk. I was really interested in what you were saying about the sort of leadership that we need to address climate change. And I appreciate like Exelon's efforts as far as the 2C2I program goes, and like internal efforts to make those sort of moves to combat climate change. But what is Exelon doing to shape the markets and put together sort of broader coalitions in the utility space that could really be that type of visionary leadership that you were talking about? You did talk about like Exelon being the cleanest utility. How are you guys focusing on, I guess, collaborating with other utilities to, I guess, spread best practices in a way?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. And I guess my initial response is it's through a series of, I would say, formal and informal channels that we do what you're talking about. The industry actually has particularly nuclear, but it transcends that across the delivery business, the wires business as well, which is, on the path of change as well, particularly at the distribution level. The industry has many different forums, coalitions that are out there for just that discussion that are formalized. And I'll talk about them first and then maybe talk about the informal coalition. So EEI, the Edison Electric Institute, is one of probably the most prominent example. It's a coalition of all the electric utilities. Our CEO was the standing chair of EEI for the last term. There's a series of initiatives that come at the forefront for the industry to tackle. And, technology, innovation, policies and things of that matter that can drive change towards climate are always at the top of those agendas, and they form the basis of the industry's advocacy on many levels. So that would be an example of one formalized structure that we're part of, along with our utility partners, and in fact chaired up until the term limit. And informally, I would say, there's an enormous amount. For instance, in my role, I have the strategy, innovation, and sustainability. And in my role, I have a lot of informal relationships with my colleagues at not only other energy companies, but other outside the industry perspectives as well, which I think is critically important. If you look at innovation, disruption, and sort of how industries have changed, not the electric, but just learn from examples, you'll see that oftentimes change comes from outside the industry. And, you know, if you look today at what's happening with transportation and how that's disrupting the, you know, electric vehicles and how that's all playing out in the traditional ICE, you know, vehicle mobility sector, look at the amount of change that's occurred in that time period. And of course, that's an impact to the utility sector, which is a fantastic opportunity to electrify transportation, which means we have to clean. So there's a lot of consortiums and groups, formal and informal, that have, you know, coalesced around the idea of electrification in our communities, and perhaps targeting, you know, how can we put forth and enable the adoption of electric vehicles in our communities in a way that's accessible and equitable for all people who want, you know, clean mobility and clean energy. And you know, so there's you know, I think if I might be so bold to say, the challenge isn't that there aren't enough of those forums and consortiums. The challenge might be there are so many, it's hard to pick and it's hard to really focus in. And so there's real power in having coalitions around these things, and it's something we encourage and try to activate in our communities.
Chris, so this is great. By the way, the questions are pouring in. So I'm going to be going to Claudia and then probably Arpana. But first of all, Barbara and Tony have questions about 2C2I, and sounds like we've got some budding entrepreneurs. Nathaniel has a question, really a great question, about this conflict between nuclear power, which is centralized big capital investment, and the pressure and the trend toward distributed resources. So there's some great questions there. I do want to go to Claudia and then others, and we're going to try and get to them all. Chris, we may have to ask you to answer some of these offline. I mean, it's just, they're pouring in.
Yeah, great. I'd rather have that than the other way, so I welcome it.
So the question, Barbara, Claudia?
Yes, so thank you, Eric. Thank you, Chris. My question is, what are the key factors that Exelon consider for making investments in climate change initiatives? I wonder if there are partnerships or alignments at a regional or state level with goals that are linked with climate change.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll answer it, you know, from the perspective of, let me talk about the 2C2I program, and then I'll just talk about, which is obviously a program within the broader business context of Exelon. The 2C2I program, because of its philanthropic nature from the foundation, is deliberately and specifically aligned and targeting the goals of the cities that we serve, sustainability goals. So if you Google up and look at, you know, Chicago or Washington, DC, they have climate action plans and sustainability reports that document where they have gone out and surveyed all of the representation of the communities within their city limits and in rural surrounding communities, and said, what is important to you in terms of mitigation and adaptation to climate change? It's not one or the other, it's both. And you know, have represented those needs from across their society in the cities in those documents and have very, very transparent and explicit goals around what they're trying to achieve. And 2C2I is targeting those goals, not the goals of our company or our commercial interest, but the goals of our company. And that's the of the cities. And that's the nature of philanthropic work is, you know, we understand we want healthy communities. It's healthy communities, climate resistant communities are part of what's integral to our success as well. So that's why we have those partnerships and we have those direction to solve those particular challenges. But that also reflects on the broader, larger investment theses of Exelon and the billions of dollars that we invest in the grid to help enable the technologies that our cities and communities have identified as important to them. So for instance, if it's solar, right, there are investments that, whether it be centralized, community, large scale, utility scale, community, or distributed, the grid needs to change. The distribution grid, the transmission grid needs to change in order to be able to accommodate those needs of our customers. And we invest in those needs to enable those goals to happen. So it's not there are many ways that we go about doing that, many different vehicles, if you will, to help enable that. But it all gets back to being responsive to what our customers need and as how it's represented by our cities.
Yeah, it sounds, by the way, I'm going to probably go to Luis next. He had a question, but before we do, Chris, you mentioned, it sounds to me that the grid or the transmission grid really needs some innovation, right? It sounds like it needs to be upgraded so it can account for distributed community utility scale. Just out of curiosity, we had a project, the fellows had a project. What region that Exelon serves, I'm not going to ask you to throw someone under the bus, but what region tends to be more innovative so that if Exelon throws out an innovation out there, which region in your service network says, we're interested?
Okay, so I'll give you an answer you probably won't like because I won't necessarily pick one, but what I will say is it greatly depends on what the innovation is and how it aligns with what the communities and customers want. So, you know, for instance, you know, we have customers in, you know, Atlantic City is one of the areas that, as you might suspect, due to, you know, the abundance of solar, you know, opportunity capture there, where distributed solar has been of interest. There's incentives and there's the opportunity for that sort of a resource, and innovations around how to make that happen are, you know, welcome by the communities in those areas. Other jurisdictions have interest in wind. You know, if you're in the upper Midwest and you're, you know, ComEd, where it's a wind-rich region. I mentioned that Illinois is one of the leaders, top 5 or at least top 10, I know, in terms of wind generation. You know, so if the Atlantic City example is distributed, and it means the distribution grid investment and change needs to occur, the ones in Northern Illinois that are next to large scale wind resources, transmission needs to be enabled to get those, get that into the market. So it really depends what and where. And it is an excellent question because it illustrates, you know, kind of how the industry needs to change in a much more surgical way than just, you know, 100 years ago when it was all about, you know, centralized power plant, distribution system, push the megawatts through the pipe to the customer. It's now about the customer and the energy source sort of on a platform for exchange of value, and how and what that is matters greatly on where you are, and therefore what resources are available, what customer interests exist. And that is the core of why, as an industry and as a company, you see us talking about customer-centric solutions, because it is not a given what the customer wants now. It has to be very specific to customer needs, depending on where you are.
Wow. So the marketing gets more complicated too. Louis, I know I mentioned you next, but Louis, I'm so sorry. Can we Aparna, do you mind jumping in on your question? I think it's related to what Chris was just saying. Aparna, Louis, I'm sorry, Louis.
Okay.
Yeah, hi. Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't listening.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Aparna?
Was it me? Okay. Hi, I just wanted to say thank you for coming. And my question was, do you think that the United States could, as like a country, could be a leading force in like world energy conservation, or do you see individuals and private companies as more of paving the way to like a cleaner and better world?
Yeah, great question. Great question. Thank you. Thanks for having me. I think that in many regards, both sort of occurring at the same time. And it's not an either or. So, when you ask a question about conservation, it gets to the leadership that this country has in terms of tech enabling technologies. An example of what you're talking about, 5, 10 years ago, whatever have you, we were at the beginning of everybody having a personal computer in their pocket that you could go look and control the energy consumption and modify, your home with sensors, and the cost of sensors have dramatically fallen. The cost of data has dramatically fallen, and the ability to utilize that with your phone and mobile device has enabled the ability for customers to have much more control over their energy consumption, understand their usage patterns. Instead of leaving your house and leaving your thermostat on a particular setting because you can't change it from away, we all know we can do that now. And I think the United States, through its leadership in digital technology and communications and all the things that enable that, will continue the policies that enable that in our country, the entrepreneurial spirit, all play together. So I think if you have entrepreneurs and technologists who are trying to bring that to market without the policies and regulatory structures that allow that's a challenge, right? Because they can't get it to market. And vice versa, if you're trying to incent that, but you don't have the underlying universities and labs and entrepreneurs who can really see that, that's a challenge too. And so I think it's the combination of the two that really is the secret sauce that makes that work. And I think we do have a leadership role in that regard. I know the energy efficiency is a critical piece of what needs to happen. So I'm really glad you asked the question. A lot of times it gets kind of put aside to the larger, where are we going to get power from? But the question of how do we conserve the power, think about what I talked about in the presentation was we need to, our best and quickest chance to get to these goals is to decarbonize electricity and use it for these other purposes like transportation, agriculture, industry. Think about the pressure that will put on the grid and the customer affordability for electricity and all these things as we use more and more of it and displace it with other forms of energy. Conservation, the more you use that conservation is going to be it already is and will continue to be an absolute necessity for customers to be able to manage their electricity even better to save money throughout that transition. Our utilities, to answer corporate, I can speak to our utilities, I think fairly representative of the industry is focused on this, but our utilities have some of the leading energy efficiency programs in the country, where we've invested significant amounts to help customers enable that future throughout this transition. And if you're not doing that, I think there will be at some point a challenge to, can we actually accomplish this? So hand in hand with this transition, and we need to have that leadership role.
So we have a lot more questions, but we probably have time for just a few more. I'm going to go to Louis, and then Val's probably going to get the last one. But before we do, Chris, it's one of those simple formulas, right? Energy not used, that's very sustainable, right? It's you know, it's that classic question. Aparna, good question. Let's go to Louis, and then Val. Be ready, Val. I think and then I really want to try to get Ifeani, but Louis.
Hello, thank you. Can you guys hear me? All right.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. Sincerely, thank you on behalf of the fellows and all the listeners. Thank you for being here. We really appreciate your time. I had a few questions, but I'll save them. One was about fearless leadership. Another was about which innovation you think needs to be focused on most. But I think most important to the fellows, the question that I have is, what are the largest challenges you believe the Midwest has to face in becoming increasingly sustainable regarding clean energy?
The Midwest. So, you know, I think the Midwest, when, you know, if you kind of tee off the geography and the localized, you know, the concept that we talked about a bit earlier with the prior questions around, it really matters where. It's not, you know, kind of the old model of, you know, push the power out and it's all the same. It's, you know, power and energy and delivery are becoming very, you know, local and specialized in many regards. You look at the Midwest and, you know, you immediately, at least from the upper Midwest, as you know, where I live and where our utilities are, I think you think about, you know, two things come to mind, and they're not by any means all of them. So I'll just talk about two that I think are highly relevant, because again, I think it's going to take kind of an all of the above approach to get where we need. But I would say, you know, clean, you know, starts with existing nuclear and wind in the upper Midwest, where the resource for wind is abundant, and nuclear, you know, carbon free, existing, not building new ones. The existing fleet is providing clean power as well in abundance. And so when you think about those two resources working together, you have a great combination of baseload clean nuclear that, you know, runs 24/7, 365 net of any planned outages, and, you know, 90 plus percent capacity production rates. And you have wind that's intermittent, but nonetheless impactful, particularly at the scale that it's been built in the upper Midwest. And so you have a great combination there, and a great opportunity for the Midwest to continue to demonstrate leadership in clean technologies. And so I think it's going to be, you know, what's going to continue to drive that is, as I've mentioned, in, you know, investment in transmission and distribution systems that are going to help bring those megawatt hours to market for customers. And, you know, things like energy storage are, you know, your question around what is, you know, I don't know that I wish I were smart enough to know which one is the one to pay the most attention to. But as I've said, the scale and size of the challenge is so large, it's hard to kind of rule anything out. So, but certainly one that tends to rise to the top is battery energy storage. And I think in that regard, if you have this intermittent resource that's clean working with this baseload resource that's clean, and you have a transmission and distribution system that's been invested in, I think the idea of having storage to help the wind balance in the grid and, you know, be able to store it and transmit and distribute when energy is most valuable to customers, I think is a key innovation and technology that's going to have to play a role in places like that, and play a role in other places that you know, have different resource mixes like solar. But again, it's about, in many ways, like society in general, like taking advantage of, like, you know, what resources and opportunities do you have kind of in your backyard, and how do you leverage them to the extent that you can, such that, you know, society benefits.
Chris, we're going to go to, thank you. Val, do you want to take a shot at this? And Shreya, I'm going to try and get you in because you have a great, tough question. Sorry, Chris, we're holding back on a tough one for you coming up. But
Okay.
Val?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights with all of us. It was absolutely fascinating learning about your travels. Just had a quick question. I'm particularly interested in public policy, and I noticed that Amy Heldman had asked a question. It kind of piqued my interest, and I was wondering if you could maybe articulate a little bit more on the various public policies and public policy work that Exelon has engaged with. I know you're based somewhat in the DC area, so just out of curiosity, what programs you're supporting or different things like that.
Yeah, I think, sure. So again, policy advocacy is you know, the sector, it's a great question because the energy, particularly the utility sector, the transmission and distribution utilities are regulated entities, right? They're earn regulated rates of return because they're the sole source of delivering energy in communities. Where the states that we happen to operate and have our business in are deregulated on the power generation side. So, and it's a patchwork across the US. If you know this, I apologize, but it's a little more than a third, I believe, of the states are deregulated on power generation, and the other bunch are fully regulated, meaning both the wires and the power generation are regulated. So they earn their returns not in a competitive market, but in a regulated construct. And so a lot of our advocacy spans both sides of our business in terms, and I think what we always put at the center of our advocacy as a principle for which we build upon is customer benefit and societal benefit. You know, are we doing and advocating for things that are in the best interest of our customers and communities? Customer meaning, you know, cost, affordability, reliability, the hallmarks of industry, and then societally, things like we're talking about now, greenhouse gases, security, you know, things of that nature. And so one thing we advocate heavily on because we're in deregulated power markets are, for instance, our nuclear plants. You know, you know, we don't have a federal price on carbon that embeds the value of carbon emission reductions into energy prices in deregulated power markets. And so having power plants that are operating and producing over half of the carbon-free power that aren't, that attribute of being carbon-free isn't recognized in the competitive market is something that we advocate to change, such that these resources, along with any other carbon resources, are given the value of that attribute, not just nuclear, but any solar, wind, any other resource that has that attribute, we believe should be compensated for it, and such that it's incentivized to be in the market for these societal purposes. And then, you know, on the distribution, the regulated utility side, it's, you know, again, very much the same sort of message, but just in the context of, you know, what do we understand? We talked about efficiency, and, you know, how should efficiency programs be designed in ways that deliver the maximum value for our customers, and, you know, those sorts of matters. So, you know, these sorts of conversations happen very much at a local community level, at a state level, all the way up through a federal level, and they're wide and varied in that regard.
So we have time for one last question, Chris. By the way, before we do, thank you, Val. Before we do, Louis asked his question about the Midwest, just to set it up, just so you know, Chris, I think he was looking ahead too. Thank you, Louis, very much. Because our next speaker this afternoon, to all the fellows who are later today, is the United Nations, and they have identified the Midwest as the key region in the United States and perhaps the world for best practices in terms of the greatest delta between what is possible and where they need to go. So I think he was asking that question, and it looks like Exelon and the United Nations will be, there's confluence of interests, so it's a good segue. So thank you, Louis, and thank you, Chris. We saved the tough one, I think a tough one. Shreya, you want to take a shot at this one? Shreya. If we can't.
Can you hear me?
I think I know your question, Shreya. If it doesn't come through, go ahead, try Shreya, and then I'll summarize.
Okay, hi. So my question was just like, I was looking to, can you hear me?
Oh, no. Shreya, I'm going to try and take a stab at it, if you don't mind, if that's okay. Chris, it's the classic question. Shareholders want profit. Profit is selling more energy.
Yeah, okay.
You know the question. I mean, Shreya, I'm so sorry, Shreya. I'm going to summarize for you, but it's a great question, Chris. It's that challenge.
Okay, so if I can paraphrase, you know, how do we reconcile shareholder interests with societal customer interests, and in the context specifically of, it would seem the incentive is to sell more megawatt hours. So how do you reconcile that with conservation and whatnot? So importantly, this gets to the Val's question. If I got your name right, previous one, and some of the other ones about efficiency. So first, setting the right policy framework, the regulatory framework that governs, you know, the regulated entities in our utilities is important to answer that question. So the concept of decoupling is very important. So our utilities that we operate are largely decoupled, and the business model, what that means is the business model has changed significantly, such that we are no longer it depends on which one you're talking about, and that's the case broadly in the sector. So there's no uniform answer to this, but you can think of it as close as you can in this way. Many utilities are at a minimum neutral shareholder value in terms of delivery of megawatt hours and consumption. So when I started, I've been with the company 20 years ago, we used to talk about, were we going to have a hot summer? Was the demand going to be up? And, you know, what would that mean for earnings and all those sorts of things? We don't talk about that anymore, because I mean, we may reference it in terms of the system demand, but we don't talk about it in terms of profitability, because our profits have been decoupled from volume, but in large part. Some of our utilities and other utilities in the country, again, difficult to broad brush this one because it's a patchwork of local regulatory constructs, are actually incentivized to lower demand for customers. So we have, for instance, at ComEd, we have, as an example, and similarly in our other utilities, we can offer rebates on energy efficiency devices and tools for customers, such, light bulbs at the counter when you buy them, or digital thermostats, or whatever the case might be, where we can offer rebates for customers to go out and acquire those tools that they need to be efficient and reach efficiency goals that we have advocated for in our states with the commissions to achieve, for the purposes that I've outlined previously, that in this transition, conservation is gonna have to be a major component of how we go forward if we're gonna enable that future, where, we have the opportunity to earn on those actions. So instead of having a divergence of interest, or at best a neutral interest, we have a completely aligned interest between what the shareholder expectation is and what the customer and the community wants. So that's how that's evolved over time, and I see that continuing to evolve. This gets a little bit to the question about, can the U.S. play a leadership role, and all these sorts of things that we've talked about previously. In order for that to happen, those sorts of policies are going to have to continue to be a critical piece of the puzzle going forward.
Chris, we're going to wrap up. It's going to come to a screeching halt just because we've gone. Thank you. There's more questions, by the way, Chris. We'll be sending them offline. Melanie, Ifeanyi, Lewis, there were more questions. And 2C2I, congratulations. And thank you, Chris. We are grateful for the Exelon SISE Fellow Achievement Awards. It's really generous, and it's appreciated. We're grateful.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation very much. And thank you for letting me indulge you all with my travel. I hope it provided an interesting backdrop to this, this whole topic. And thank you for your very thoughtful questions and your work that we're happy to sponsor. It's very critical. I mentioned this whole notion of local connectivity and knowing where to go and find startups. And that's, the reason we're so interested in that and developing that ecosystem, in and around our community. So appreciate that. Appreciate your thoughtful questions and the invitation to be with you today.